The university's funding email had made this opportunity sound like a dream assignment. 3 months of atmospheric research in Alaska, decent pay, and enough isolation to focus entirely on data collection without distractions. I'd packed my equipment with genuine excitement, imagining the breakthrough research that might come from such pristine conditions. Now, stepping out of the supply truck that had carried me the final 30 miles from the nearest town, I questioned every decision that had led me here. The research station squatted against the white landscape like a metal tumor, its dark walls stark against snow that stretched to every horizon. No trees, no hills, no variation whatsoever. Just flat white emptiness that seemed to swallow sound and perspective alike. The wind cut through my heavy jacket as if the fabric didn't exist, and I realized my preparation for cold weather had been laughably inadequate. Daniel Martinez, I presume. The voice belonged to a man who'd emerged from the station's main entrance. He looked like he'd been carved from the same harsh material as the landscape itself. Weathered face, graying beard, and eyes that held the steady wariness of someone who'd seen too much. David Miller, I run this place. I hefted my duffel bag and approached, fighting the urge to hurry, the cold bit at every exposed inch of skin, making my nose run and my eyes water. Thanks for having me. The university said you might need an extra hand with atmospheric readings. David's handshake was brief but firm. Come on, let's get you inside before you freeze to death your first day. The station's interior hit me like a wall of stale air and artificial heat. Cramped corridors lined with pipes and electrical conduits led past what appeared to be labs, storage rooms, and living quarters. Every window I glimpsed had been covered with thick, dark curtains that blocked out any view of the outside world. The effect was claustrophobic, like being sealed inside a submarine. Drop your gear in here. David opened a door to reveal a small room with a narrow bed, a desk, and barely enough floor space to walk around. Not the Ritz, but it's warm and the walls are thick. I set down my bag and followed him back into the corridor. The muffled quality of our footsteps and voices made everything feel unnaturally quiet, as if the building itself absorbed sound. Other doors stood closed along the hallway, and I caught myself wondering how many people actually worked here. Before you settle in, we need to cover the station rules. David's tone shifted, becoming more serious. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're survival requirements, and breaking them can get you killed. The dramatic phrasing made me want to smile, but something in his expression stopped me. I'd expected the usual workplace safety briefings about proper equipment handling and emergency procedures. This felt different. First rule: never look outside between 11:11 and 3:33. Doesn't matter if you hear something. Doesn't matter if you think you see movement. Those windows stay covered during those hours, and you don't peek. I opened my mouth to ask what could possibly be dangerous about looking outside, but David continued without pause. Second, never answer knocking at the door during night hours. If someone knocks after dark, you ignore it completely. No exceptions, no matter what you think you hear. My scientific training kicked in, demanding explanations for these bizarre prohibitions. What kind of research station operated under such paranoid restrictions? Third, every Monday at exactly 5 p.m., we do a supply check. Full inventory, every item accounted for. You'll be assigned specific areas to cover. Fourth, report any holes in the ice immediately. You see a hole that wasn't there before, you tell me right away. Fifth, report strange behavior from staff members. If someone starts acting unusual or saying odd things, I need to know. Sixth, never go outside after dark. Not for any reason. Equipment emergency, fire, doesn't matter. After sunset, this building is sealed until dawn. The rules hung in the air between us like a challenge. I processed each one, trying to find rational explanations for what sounded like elaborate superstitions. Isolation psychology, maybe. Extended periods in harsh environments could definitely affect judgment and spawn irrational fears. I know how they sound, David said as if reading my thoughts. You're thinking this is paranoid nonsense brought on by too much isolation. Every new researcher thinks that. Before I could respond, footsteps approached from deeper in the corridor. A woman appeared, middle-aged, practical-looking, wearing the same heavy indoor clothing that seemed standard here. "Sarah Johnson," she introduced herself with a brief nod. "How much have you told him?" "Just finished the rules," David replied. Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Good. Let me be clear about something, Daniel. Those rules David just gave you, they're not suggestions. They're not outdated protocols or superstitious nonsense. People who break them don't make it home." The matter-of-fact way she said it sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. These weren't people prone to dramatic exaggeration. Their entire bearing suggested practical, experienced professionals. Yet, here they were, speaking about window curtains and knocking sounds as if they were matters of life and death. "I understand you're skeptical," Sarah continued. "That's normal. But skepticism won't protect you if you decide to test these rules. The Arctic doesn't care about your scientific training or rational worldview. I wanted to ask what exactly they thought was outside that could be so dangerous. Bears, maybe? Extreme weather phenomena? But something in their shared glances suggested they weren't going to elaborate, at least not yet. "Let me show you the common areas," David said, apparently considering the orientation complete. We walked through a kitchen area equipped with industrial appliances and a dining space with a single long table. Every surface looked well maintained but showed signs of heavy use. More covered windows lined the walls, creating the same oppressive sense of enclosure I'd felt throughout the building. "Meals are communal," Sarah explained. "We eat together, work together, look out for each other. In a place like this, teamwork isn't optional." As if summoned by her words, another figure emerged from what appeared to be a lab area. A man in his 30s, pale and thin, wearing a heavy sweater that seemed too large for his frame. He glanced at me briefly, but didn't speak. "Thomas Brown," David said. "He handles our meteorological readings." Thomas nodded once in my direction, then turned his attention to one of the covered windows. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, as if listening for something beyond the thick curtains. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly. He blinked and walked away without a word, disappearing back into the lab area. "He's been here 8 months, David explained after Thomas was gone. "Takes a while to adjust to the isolation." I noted the interaction with growing unease. Thomas's behavior had been odd, but the way Sarah and David reacted suggested this wasn't unusual. The idea that extended isolation could affect people so dramatically was concerning, especially given that I'd committed to spending 3 months here myself. The tour continued through lab spaces equipped with atmospheric monitoring equipment, storage rooms packed with supplies, and mechanical areas housing generators and heating systems. Everything was functional but cramped, and the constant presence of covered windows made it impossible to forget we were sealed inside this metal box. As evening approached, I noticed the staff beginning what appeared to be a ritual. Sarah moved through the common areas, checking that curtains were properly positioned. David tested the locks on all exterior doors. Even Thomas emerged from his lab to inspect window coverings in his area. "Nightly routine," David explained when he caught me watching. "We double-check everything before dark." I helped Sarah with the remaining windows, pulling heavy blankets over glass that had been left uncovered during daylight hours. The blankets were thick and black, designed to block out every trace of light or view. As we worked, the oppressive atmosphere of the station intensified, transforming from merely claustrophobic to actively unsettling. "Why cover them all?" I asked as we secured the last blanket. "Seems like natural light would be good for morale." Sarah paused in her work. "Natural light during the day is fine, but after dark, these windows stay covered. Period." The finality in her voice made it clear this wasn't open for discussion. I finished helping with the blankets, trying to shake off the growing sense that I'd committed to something far more complex than atmospheric research. As the evening routine concluded and the staff settled into their normal activities, I found myself standing in the kitchen area, processing everything I'd learned. The rules, the covered windows, the strange behavior patterns, none of it aligned with my expectations of a scientific research facility. My academic training had prepared me for data collection, equipment maintenance, and the challenge of working in extreme conditions. It hadn't prepared me for elaborate behavioral restrictions that sounded more like folklore than safety protocols. The rational part of my mind insisted that prolonged isolation could indeed create paranoid thinking patterns, and that these rules were likely the product of too many people spending too much time in an enclosed space. But watching David and Sarah move through their evening preparations with practiced efficiency, seeing the genuine concern in their expressions when discussing the rules, made it harder to dismiss their warnings as simple paranoia. These were experienced professionals who'd survived in this environment long enough to become experts. If they believed these precautions were necessary, maybe I needed to consider that they knew something I didn't. Still, the scientific method demanded evidence, and so far I'd seen nothing that couldn't be explained by isolation psychology and extreme weather conditions. Whatever had convinced my colleagues that elaborate window-covering rituals were necessary for survival, I was confident my rational approach would help me adapt to the harsh environment without falling into the same superstitious patterns. Chapter 2. My first night in the small room felt like being sealed inside a metal coffin. The narrow bed was surprisingly comfortable, but the complete absence of outside light or sound made it impossible to gauge time or orientation. I'd tried reading through some research notes, organizing my equipment, anything to distract from the oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Around 11, I finally gave up on productive activity and changed into sleep clothes, though my internal clock felt completely scrambled. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical precision, and occasionally I heard muffled footsteps or doors closing elsewhere in the station. Normal sounds of people settling in for the night. I was lying on the narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling and questioning my decision to take this assignment, when my watch face glowed 11:11 p.m. The first sound came from directly above my room, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the roof. I sat up, listening intently. The scraping moved from left to right, then paused. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations. Ice buildup sliding off the roof, thermal expansion causing structural settling, Arctic wind carrying debris across the metal surface. All perfectly reasonable possibilities for a building in extreme weather conditions. Then came the footsteps. Not the quick patter of small animals or the random impact of falling ice. These were measured, purposeful steps that circled the station with mechanical precision. Each footfall landed with enough force to vibrate through the building's frame, making my bed shake slightly. The rhythm was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. I swung my legs out of bed and moved toward the covered window in my room. My hand reached for the edge of the heavy blanket before David's words echoed in my memory. Never look outside between 11:11 and 3:33. Breaking them can get you killed. The scientific part of my brain screamed that this was exactly the kind of irrational behavior that isolation bred. Whatever was outside could be observed, documented, explained through proper investigation. Knowledge was always better than fear-based superstition. But my hand stopped inches from the curtain fabric. The footsteps completed their circuit around the building and began again, this time accompanied by that scraping sound. Something was systematically moving around the station's perimeter, and the impacts were strong enough to transmit through the foundation into my room. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt each step as a distinct vibration. Around midnight, the sounds intensified. The scraping became more violent, as if whatever was outside had started clawing at the building's exterior walls. The footsteps quickened their pace, circling faster with increasing urgency. Then came a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. Howling. Not the familiar cry of wolves or the whistle of wind through structures. This was something deeper, more guttural, with an otherworldly quality that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest cavity. The sound rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like language, though no language I'd ever heard. I found myself pressing both hands against my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it seemed to penetrate through bone and tissue. The howling continued in waves, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it felt like the source was directly outside my window. Then the knocking started. Methodical, persistent raps on what sounded like the main entrance. Not the frantic pounding of someone seeking emergency shelter, but patient, rhythmic knocking that continued without variation. Knock, knock, knock. A brief pause. Then the pattern repeated. I heard movement in the corridor outside my room. Soft footsteps, then Sarah's voice in a barely audible whisper. "It's just wind. We all know it's just wind." Her words carried no conviction whatsoever. The knocking continued, relentless and mechanical, for what felt like 20 minutes. During this time, the scraping and footsteps never stopped. Whatever was outside wasn't a single entity. Multiple things were moving around the station simultaneously. The knocking shifted. Instead of coming from the main entrance, the sound now originated from the side of the building, then the back, then another side. Whatever was responsible moved around the station's perimeter, testing each door and entrance with the same patient, methodical rapping. The urgency in the knocking increased. What had been steady and mechanical became more aggressive, more insistent. The sound of something trying different entrances with growing determination. Each new location brought the noise closer to my room, and I realized that if I'd been standing at the window, I would have been mere feet away from whatever was making these sounds. I pulled my pillow over my head, but the knocking penetrated through every layer of fabric and insulation. The howling continued between the rapping sessions, sometimes rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The building vibrated constantly now with the movement of multiple large forms circling and testing our defenses. My scientific training kept trying to assert itself. Animals seeking shelter, seismic activity, extreme weather phenomena. But the systematic nature of the sounds, the way they tested each entrance in sequence, the almost intelligent pattern to the investigation, none of it fit natural explanations. Hours passed in this acoustic torment. I watched my watch face change from midnight to 1 a.m., then 2, then 3. The sounds never diminished, never paused for more than a few seconds. Whatever was outside possessed inhuman endurance and patience. At exactly 3:33 a.m., everything stopped. The silence was so abrupt and complete that my ears rang from the sudden absence of noise. No gradual fading, no distant footsteps retreating into the wilderness. One moment the building shook with activity, the next it was as if nothing had ever been there. I lay in bed, straining to hear any residual sound, but found only the normal mechanical noises of the heating system and the distant hum of electrical equipment. The oppressive quiet that had bothered me earlier now felt like a blessing. Sleep was impossible. I spent the remaining hours until dawn lying motionless, processing what I'd experienced. Every rational explanation I could construct fell apart under the systematic, intelligent nature of what I'd witnessed. This wasn't random animal behavior or weather phenomena. Something had methodically investigated our station, tested our defenses, and demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything I thought I understood about Arctic wildlife. When early morning light began filtering through gaps around the covered windows, I dressed quickly and made my way to the kitchen area. My legs felt unsteady, and I realized I'd been unconsciously holding tension in every muscle for hours. Sarah was already there, making coffee with practiced efficiency. She looked tired, but not particularly disturbed, as if the night's events had been routine. "Sleep well?" she asked without looking up. "Not particularly. Did you hear those sounds last night?" "What sounds?" Her tone was carefully neutral. I studied her expression, trying to determine if she was genuinely unaware or deliberately avoiding the topic. The way she'd whispered about wind suggested she'd heard everything I had. Nothing, I guess. Must have been the building settling. Sarah nodded and handed me a mug of coffee. Arctic nights can be unsettling until you get used to them. After breakfast, I needed fresh air and perspective. The previous night felt like a fever dream, and I hoped that daylight and normal outdoor activities would help restore my rational worldview. I bundled into my heavy winter gear and stepped outside for the first time since my arrival. The morning air was brutally cold, but crystal clear. Sunlight reflected off snow that stretched to every horizon, creating a landscape so white and featureless it hurt to look at directly. After the claustrophobic atmosphere of the station, the open space felt liberating. I walked around the building's perimeter, ostensibly to familiarize myself with the facility's exterior layout. In reality, I was looking for evidence of the previous night's activity. What I found made my blood run cold. Massive indentations marked the snow around the entire station, not the scattered tracks of normal wildlife, but deep, purposeful impressions that followed a systematic pattern. The prints, if they could be called that, were enormous, each one nearly 3 feet across, and pressed so deeply into the frozen ground that they'd broken through the snow layer into the earth beneath. I knelt beside one of the clearer impressions, trying to make sense of its shape. The outline was roughly circular but irregular, with what appeared to be claw marks radiating from the edges. Whatever had made these tracks possessed weight and size far beyond any Arctic animal I could identify. The prints circled the station exactly as I'd tracked the sounds the night before, around the main entrance, along each side wall, testing every door and window. Some areas showed evidence of scraping against the building's exterior, long gouges in the metal siding that matched the sounds I'd heard. Find something interesting? I spun around to find David approaching, his expression grim but unsurprised. "These tracks," I said, gesturing at the indentations. "What kind of animal makes prints this size?" David examined the marks with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen them before. His lack of shock or curiosity was more unsettling than the tracks themselves. "Some things are better left uninvestigated," he said finally. "You'd do well to remember that." "But the size of these impressions?" "I know what size they are." David's tone cut off further discussion. "I also know that asking too many questions about them doesn't lead anywhere good." He walked away, leaving me standing alone beside evidence that challenged every assumption I'd brought to this place. The tracks were real, physical proof that something far outside normal parameters had visited our station. Yet David's response suggested that acknowledging this reality was somehow dangerous. I spent another hour examining the impressions, measuring their dimensions and spacing, trying to construct any plausible explanation for their existence. But as the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, the tracks began to blur and soften as the snow warmed. By midday, they would be gone, leaving only my memory and growing certainty that the rules I'd dismissed as paranoid superstition were the only thing standing between us and something I wasn't equipped to understand. The rest of Monday passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt increasingly brittle. After David's warning about the tracks, I threw myself into settling into the research routine, unpacking my atmospheric monitoring equipment and familiarizing myself with the station's data collection protocols. The work felt reassuring: concrete procedures, measurable variables, rational explanations for natural phenomena. Everything my scientific training had prepared me to handle. At exactly 5 p.m., David's voice echoed through the station's intercom system. "Monday supply check. Everyone to your assigned areas." I followed Sarah to the main storage room, where she handed me a clipboard with inventory sheets. The routine was methodical and precise, counting every can, bag, and container, checking expiration dates, noting any discrepancies from the master list. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, calling out items while I tracked quantities on the forms. Canned tomatoes, 12 units, dried beans, 8 bags, pasta, 15 boxes. Her voice carried the monotone rhythm of someone who'd performed this task hundreds of times. I was halfway through checking the canned goods section when my pen stopped moving. "Sarah, what's this?" She looked over to where I was pointing at an empty can sitting in the trash bin near the shelving unit. The label was clearly visible. Premium cat food. Salmon flavor. "That's odd." Sarah picked up the can and examined it. "We don't have any cats here." I checked the supply manifest on my clipboard, running my finger down the list of delivered items. No pet food of any kind appeared on the records. The can wasn't weathered or old. The label was bright and new, suggesting recent purchase and consumption. "Maybe it got mixed in with a personal order by mistake," I suggested. Sarah set the can on the nearest shelf and continued with the inventory, but I caught her looking back at it several times. Her expression held the same careful wariness I'd seen when she discussed the station rules. 20 minutes later, we discovered something worse. "Daniel, come look at this." Sarah was crouched behind a stack of supply crates in the back corner of the storage room. When I joined her, she pointed to 3 bags of dry cat food sitting on the floor. Each bag was 20 pounds, still sealed, with purchase stickers indicating they'd been bought within the last month. "These weren't on the delivery manifest either," she said quietly. I checked the inventory sheets again, looking for any mention of pet supplies or items that might have been miscategorized. Nothing. According to our official records, these bags didn't exist. Could someone have ordered them privately? All orders go through David. Nothing comes to the station without being logged. Sarah's voice carried a tension that made my stomach clench. These appeared somewhere they shouldn't be. We finished the supply check in uncomfortable silence. The unexplained cat food items sat there like evidence of something we couldn't name or understand. When we completed the count and double-checked our numbers, I noticed Sarah made no notation about the cat food on the official inventory forms. I found Thomas in the meteorological station, a cramped room filled with monitoring equipment and computer terminals. He was standing motionless in front of a covered window, his back to me, hands at his sides. "Thomas, we found something weird during the supply check." He didn't respond or turn around. There was cat food in storage, multiple items that aren't on any delivery records. I waited for him to acknowledge what I'd said, but he remained perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the quiet humming of electronic equipment and the distant rumble of the heating system. "Thomas?" Finally, he turned around. His movement was unnaturally slow, like someone emerging from deep sleep. When his eyes met mine, they held an expression I couldn't read. Not quite recognition, not quite confusion. Something else entirely. He looked at me without blinking for what felt like an entire minute. Not the brief, awkward pause of someone processing information, but a sustained, unnerving stare that made me want to step backward. His eyes didn't move or shift focus. They remained fixed on my face with mechanical precision. Then, without a word, he walked past me and left the room. I stood there processing what had just happened. Thomas's behavior was far beyond the normal effects of isolation or social awkwardness. The way he'd stared at me felt predatory, as if he was studying my features for some purpose I couldn't fathom. Later that afternoon, David's voice again crackled through the intercom. "Everyone outside. Found something near the generator shed." I bundled into my winter gear and joined Sarah and Thomas in the brutal cold. David was standing about 50 feet from the station's main building, near a metal shed that housed backup generators and fuel storage. Even from a distance, I could see he was looking down at something in the snow. As we approached, the object of his attention became clear. A perfectly round hole had been cut through the ice, creating a dark opening roughly 3 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth and precise, as if someone had used a giant cookie cutter to remove a section of frozen ground. "When did this appear?" Sarah asked. "Wasn't here this morning when I checked the generators," David replied. "Found it an hour ago during routine maintenance." I knelt beside the hole and peered into the blackness below. The opening seemed impossibly deep. My flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness without revealing a bottom. No matter how I adjusted the angle or brightness, the light was simply swallowed by whatever lay beneath the ice. How deep does it go? David was already walking back toward the station. Deep enough. Stay here. He returned carrying a large pot of steaming water from the kitchen. Without explanation, he began pouring the hot water directly into the hole. The liquid disappeared into the blackness without making any sound. No splash, no echo, nothing to indicate it had reached a bottom. What are you doing? Holes like this attract things from below the ice, David said, continuing to pour. Hot water keeps them from using it as an exit point. The casual way he said it, as if sealing mysterious holes against subterranean creatures was routine maintenance, made my scientific worldview feel increasingly unstable. I wanted to ask what things he meant, but his expression discouraged further questions. We returned inside as the sun began setting and evening routines commenced. During dinner, the four of us sat around the long table in the kitchen area, eating reheated stew and canned vegetables. Conversation was minimal, mostly logistics about equipment schedules and weather observations. I was discussing atmospheric pressure readings with Sarah when I noticed Thomas had stopped eating. His fork was suspended halfway between his bowl and mouth, loaded with food but completely motionless. He was looking at something behind me, his expression vacant and unfocused. "Thomas?" Sarah said. No response. Thomas remained frozen in position, as if someone had pressed a pause button on his movements. His eyes were fixed on the wall behind my chair, but they didn't seem to be looking at anything specific. They held the same mechanical quality I'd observed earlier, but now combined with complete physical stillness that was deeply unsettling. I turned to follow his line of sight, but the wall was blank except for a few mounted emergency procedures and shift schedules, nothing that should have captured such intense attention. "Thomas," Sarah repeated more firmly. She reached across the table and touched his shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, Thomas jerked back to awareness with a sharp intake of breath. The fork continued its journey to his mouth as if nothing had happened. "Sorry. What?" "You were somewhere else for a moment," Sarah said carefully. Thomas looked around the table with apparent confusion. "Was I? I don't remember." The complete absence of memory was perhaps the most disturbing part. Thomas showed no awareness that he'd been catatonic for nearly 10 minutes, no recollection of what had captured his attention or why he'd stopped moving. After dinner, I helped clean dishes while processing the day's events. The cat food, the hole in the ice, Thomas's episodes, each incident individually might have rational explanations. Food delivery mistakes happened. Ground could shift and create openings. Isolation could cause dissociative episodes. But taken together, they formed a pattern that my scientific training couldn't accommodate. These weren't random occurrences or psychological effects of harsh conditions. They were systematic anomalies that suggested something fundamental about this place existed outside normal parameters. The staff's reactions bothered me as much as the events themselves. David's calm acceptance of mysterious holes, Sarah's careful documentation of impossible supply discrepancies, Thomas's complete memory lapses. None of them seemed surprised by what was happening. They responded to each incident with the weary recognition of people who'd seen it all before. Standing in the kitchen, drying plates while Sarah organized supplies for tomorrow's meals, I realized my comfortable skepticism was crumbling. Whatever was affecting this station wasn't isolation, madness, or environmental psychology. Something was genuinely wrong with this place. Something that turned normal research protocols into survival requirements and made covering windows a matter of life and death. The rules I'd dismissed as paranoid superstition were starting to feel like the only rational response to circumstances that defied rational explanation. I woke on the fourth morning with the taste of unease already coating my mouth. The heating system's mechanical breathing filled the silence as I dressed, but something felt different about the station's atmosphere. A subtle shift that made my skin crawl without any obvious cause. The kitchen was empty when I arrived, which wasn't unusual given the early hour. I opened the storage room to prepare breakfast and immediately knew something was wrong. The shelves looked sparse in a way that didn't match my memory from the previous evening's inventory. I pulled out my notebook and compared the current contents against the supply list we'd completed Monday night. 3 cans of beans were missing, 2 boxes of pasta, an entire bag of flour that should have lasted weeks. The numbers didn't add up to normal consumption, even accounting for 4 people eating 3 meals daily. More unsettling were the crumb trails I found leading away from the storage area. Fine traces of breadcrumbs and flour formed distinct paths across the floor, winding through the common areas towards sections of the station I'd never seen anyone enter. One trail disappeared under a maintenance closet door that had been sealed with multiple layers of industrial tape. I knelt beside the closet and examined the door frame. The tape showed recent disturbance, edges peeled back just enough for something small to slip through. The crumb trail continued right up to the gap, as if whatever had taken our food was storing it in there. The rational part of my brain suggested mice or other rodents, but the quantity of missing supplies ruled out normal pest activity. Animals didn't make off with entire containers or leave such organized trails. This looked more like systematic removal by something with purpose and intelligence. Sarah found me crouched by the closet when she came to start breakfast preparations. "What are you doing down there?" I showed her the crumb trails and explained the inventory discrepancies. Her expression grew progressively more troubled as I detailed exactly what was missing and in what quantities. "That's not possible," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "We accounted for everything Monday." "Look at the numbers yourself." Sarah spent 20 minutes rechecking the storage room contents against our official lists. Her face went pale as the magnitude of the shortage became clear. "Someone's been taking food during the night," I said. "Multiple meals worth." "Nobody here would do that." I wanted to agree, but the evidence was undeniable. Food was disappearing in quantities no single person could consume, and the crumb trails suggested it was being moved to areas nobody should have been accessing. When David arrived for breakfast, I showed him the inventory problems and the sealed closet with disturbed tape. His reaction was what bothered me most, not surprise or concern, but a weary acceptance that made my stomach clench. "These things happen sometimes," he said, as if massive food theft was routine maintenance. "Things like what?" "Someone's been stealing from our supplies." David examined the crumb trails with the same detached interest he'd shown when looking at the mysterious tracks outside. No shock, no urgency about our depleting resources. "I'll look into it," he said finally, but his tone suggested he had no intention of investigating anything. Thomas appeared during this conversation, emerging from his lab area with the same vacant expression I'd grown to expect. He moved through the kitchen without acknowledging any of us, going straight to the covered window near the dining table. He stood motionless in front of the heavy curtains for several minutes, close enough that his breath fogged the fabric. His posture was unnaturally rigid, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly as if listening for something beyond the glass. "Thomas, breakfast is ready," Sarah called. No response. Thomas remained frozen in position, completely absorbed by whatever held his attention behind the covered window. The sight of him standing there sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. I approached him carefully, noting how his eyes were fixed on one specific section of the curtain. Up close, I could see his pupils were dilated despite the bright kitchen lighting, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Thomas, you need to eat." My voice seemed to reach him from a great distance. He blinked several times, then turned toward me with the slow, disoriented movement of someone emerging from a trance. "Did you say something?" The complete absence of memory was becoming a pattern. Thomas showed no awareness of how long he'd been standing there or what had captured his attention. He joined us at the table and ate mechanically, but I caught him looking back at the covered window repeatedly throughout the meal. Later that morning, I was calibrating atmospheric monitoring equipment when I heard Sarah's voice from the storage room. "Thomas, what are you doing in here?" I found them both standing beside the sealed maintenance closet. Thomas had his hands on the tape around the door frame, and several strips had been partially peeled away. "I thought I heard something inside," he said, but his explanation sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. Sarah looked at the disturbed tape, then at Thomas, her expression growing concerned. "This area is sealed for safety reasons. Nobody should be opening it." Thomas nodded and walked away, but I noticed he kept looking back at the closet as he left. The way he'd been working at the tape suggested he'd been trying to gain access for some time, not responding to a sudden noise. That afternoon brought another disturbing discovery. I was organizing research notes in my room when Sarah knocked on my door. "Can I talk to you privately?" She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, keeping her voice to a whisper. "Thomas has been asking questions about you. Personal information that doesn't make sense for someone at a research station." The hair on my neck stood up. "What kind of questions?" "Your home address, details about your family members, whether you live alone." Sarah's expression was deeply troubled. "He wanted to know if anyone would notice if you didn't return from this assignment." The implications of Thomas's inquiries made my blood run cold. There was no legitimate reason for a meteorologist at an isolated station to need personal information about a colleague's home life or family situation. Why would he ask those things? I don't know, but it's not normal behavior, even accounting for isolation effects. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's been different since you arrived, more fixated on things he shouldn't be interested in." The idea that my presence had somehow triggered changes in Thomas's behavior was deeply unsettling. Whatever was affecting him seemed to be accelerating, becoming more focused and potentially dangerous. That evening, I spent several hours calculating our remaining food supplies with scientific precision. No matter how I adjusted the numbers or accounted for potential errors, the results were consistently alarming. Based on normal consumption patterns, we had maybe 2 days of food remaining. The next scheduled supply delivery wasn't due for 3 weeks. Even with severe rationing, we couldn't stretch our resources to cover that gap. The missing food represented more than inconvenience. It was a genuine survival crisis that nobody seemed willing to address directly. I found David in his office, reviewing meteorological reports and maintenance schedules. When I presented my calculations about our food shortage, his reaction was even more disturbing than his earlier indifference. "You think we're running out of supplies?" "I know we are. Look at these numbers." David examined my calculations with the same detached interest he'd shown for every other anomaly. No urgency, no concern about potential starvation in an isolated location. "Maybe you should consider leaving early," he said finally. The suggestion hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Not a helpful recommendation or concerned advice, but something that felt much more like a threat. "The supply truck won't be back for 3 weeks. There are other ways to leave." David's eyes went completely blank as he said this. Not the vacant expression of someone lost in thought, but a total absence of awareness that lasted several seconds. When focus returned to his features, he looked at me as if surprised to find me standing there. The transformation was brief, but unmistakable. For those few moments, David had been somewhere else entirely, and whatever had been speaking through him carried implications that made every instinct in my body scream warnings. I left his office with the growing certainty that our food shortage wasn't accidental or natural. Someone, or something, was systematically depleting our resources, creating a crisis that would force difficult choices. The station's rules suddenly felt less like paranoid restrictions and more like the only barrier standing between us and something that wanted us gone, or worse, wanted us desperate enough to break those rules and face whatever waited outside in the Arctic darkness. My hands shook as I pulled on every layer of winter gear I owned, but not from the cold. The decision had been eating at me for hours, growing more urgent as our food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. 1 can of beans and half a bag of rice remained in storage, maybe enough for breakfast if we stretched it thin. David's suggestion about other ways to leave kept echoing in my head. along with that blank expression that had replaced his features when he said it. Whatever was happening to the station staff was accelerating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that staying much longer would mean joining Thomas in his catatonic episodes or losing myself to whatever influence had already claimed them. The snowmobile sat in the equipment shed behind the main building, a heavy-duty Arctic model designed for exactly this kind of terrain. I'd checked it during my first week, noting the full fuel tank and emergency supplies strapped to the back. 15 miles to Coldwater, the nearest town marked on every map I'd studied, a manageable distance if I pushed hard and didn't stop for anything. I slipped out of my room at exactly 9 p.m., moving through the station's corridors with practiced stealth. The heating system's mechanical breathing masked my footsteps, and the covered windows made it impossible for anyone to see outside. David was in his office reviewing reports. Sarah was organizing supplies in the kitchen. Thomas was standing motionless in front of another covered window, lost in whatever trance claimed him each evening. None of them noticed me leaving. The equipment shed door opened with a metallic groan that sounded thunderous in the Arctic silence. I wheeled the snowmobile outside, my breath forming instant clouds in air so cold it burned my lungs through the heavy face mask. The temperature gauge on my gear showed minus 38 degrees, brutal even by Arctic standards. The moment I stepped fully outside, something changed in the quality of darkness around me. Not a visible alteration, but a shift in presence that made every nerve in my body fire warning signals. The black expanse beyond the station's exterior lights felt populated now, filled with attention that hadn't been there during my brief daytime excursions. I was being watched. The snowmobile's engine turned over reluctantly, mechanical parts protesting the extreme temperature. 3 attempts before it caught, rumbling to life with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire tundra. I adjusted the headlight beam and checked the GPS unit mounted on the handlebars. Coldwater lay 15 miles due south, a straight shot across relatively flat terrain. I twisted the throttle and shot away from the station into complete darkness. The headlight carved a narrow tunnel through the black, illuminating maybe 30 feet of snow-covered ground ahead of me. Beyond that beam, the world ceased to exist. No horizon, no reference points, just an endless void that swallowed light and sound alike. The snowmobile's engine roared beneath me, but the noise felt muffled and small against the vast silence pressing in from all directions. 5 miles out, the GPS showed I was making good time despite the challenging terrain. The engine had warmed up enough to run smoothly, and the fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. At this pace, I'd reach Coldwater in under an hour. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large shifted just beyond the headlight's reach, keeping pace with my snowmobile despite my speed of nearly 40 miles per hour. I turned my head to get a better look, but the moment I focused on the area, nothing was there, just empty darkness and wind-blown snow. I accelerated, pushing the snowmobile harder across the uneven ground. The speedometer climbed to 50, then 55. The movement stayed with me, matching my pace effortlessly. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of something massive moving parallel to my route, but every direct look revealed only darkness. Whatever was out there, it was big enough to leave visible disturbance in the snow. I could see the faint traces of its passage in my peripheral vision, displaced powder and irregular shadows that suggested something moving with purpose and intelligence. Not the random wandering of an animal, but deliberate tracking behavior. 7 miles from the station, the presence shifted position. Instead of pacing me from the side, I caught movement directly ahead of my headlight beam. Something crossed from left to right just at the edge of visibility, fast enough that I only registered a brief impression of size and darkness before it disappeared. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what that meant. Whatever was following me had somehow gotten ahead of my position without passing through the lighted area. It had moved around me through the darkness, covering ground faster than my snowmobile despite the difficult terrain. That wasn't possible for any normal animal. I pushed the throttle to maximum, feeling the snowmobile strain against its mechanical limits. The engine screamed in protest, but the speedometer climbed past 60. Snow and ice chips flew past my goggles in a constant stream, and the cold air penetrated every gap in my protective gear. The movement in my peripheral vision intensified. Whatever was out there seemed energized by my acceleration, becoming more active and aggressive. I caught glimpses of something keeping perfect pace with me, sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, occasionally appearing ahead of me as if it had teleported through the darkness. 9 miles out, something brushed against the back of my snowmobile. The contact was brief but unmistakable. A physical touch that sent vibrations through the machine's frame. I twisted around to look behind me, but my headlight only illuminated the path ahead. The darkness at my back remained complete and impenetrable. Whatever had touched my snowmobile was close enough to make physical contact while I was traveling at high speed. The implications of that made my hands shake on the handlebars. No earthly creature could match this kind of performance across Arctic terrain. No animal moved with such intelligence and persistence while remaining essentially invisible. 10 miles from the station, 11, 12. The GPS showed I was more than halfway to Coldwater, but the presence tracking me showed no signs of fatigue or decreased interest. If anything, it seemed to be getting more aggressive as we neared civilization. The glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision became more frequent and bold, and I could feel something large moving just outside my light beam with increasing urgency. The town's glow appeared on the horizon at 13 miles, a faint amber smudge against the black sky that represented warmth, safety, and normal human existence. Streetlights and house windows, people going about their evening routines, electric heating and stocked refrigerators. Everything the research station had stripped away. The presence seemed to notice the distant lights too. Its behavior changed immediately, becoming more frantic and aggressive. Movement flickered constantly at the edges of my vision now, and I could hear sounds beneath the snowmobile's engine roar. Not animal calls or natural noises, but something that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest cavity, just like the howling I'd heard on my first night. 14 miles. The town's lights grew brighter and more distinct. Individual street lamps became visible, along with the warm yellow glow of windows and the organized geometry of roads and buildings. Normal civilization, governed by normal rules where mysterious creatures didn't pursue people across frozen wastelands. At 14.5 miles, just as the first detailed shapes of Coldwater became visible in my headlight beam, something massive brushed against the side of my snowmobile. The contact was forceful enough to knock me sideways, sending the machine into a skidding slide across the icy surface. I fought to regain control, pulling hard on the handlebars as the snowmobile threatened to tip over completely. For several terrifying seconds, I was sliding sideways at high speed with no traction and no control over my direction. The machine straightened out just as the first streetlight came into clear view ahead of me. Behind me, I felt rather than saw the presence pull back into the darkness, its attention withdrawing like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. Whatever had been tracking me across 12 miles of Arctic wilderness had stopped pursuing me the moment civilization became real rather than distant. The snowmobile's engine coughed and died as I coasted into the parking lot outside Mel's 24-hour diner, the only building in Coldwater showing signs of life at 2 a.m. Neon beer signs flickered in the windows, and warm yellow light spilled across the snow-covered asphalt. The contrast between this ordinary scene and the nightmare I had just escaped felt so stark it made my head spin. I sat on the motionless snowmobile for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled and watching the empty street beyond the diner. Nothing moved in the shadows between streetlights. No massive shapes tracked my position from the darkness. My legs shook when I finally stood up. Whether from the extreme cold or adrenaline, I couldn't tell. Every exposed inch of skin burned from the wind chill, and my face mask had frozen to my beard with accumulated moisture from my breathing. I left the snowmobile where it sat and stumbled toward the diner's entrance, desperate for warmth and human contact after hours of being hunted through absolute darkness. The bell above the door chimed as I pushed inside, and a wave of heated air hit me like a physical embrace. The interior looked exactly like every small-town diner I'd ever seen. Vinyl booths, checkerboard floors, and the smell of coffee that had been brewing since the previous afternoon. A middle-aged waitress with graying hair looked up from wiping down the counter, taking in my heavy winter gear and probably the wild expression I couldn't hide. "Rough night out there, hun?" I pulled off my face mask and tried to form words that would make sense to someone who lived in a normal world where creatures didn't stalk people across frozen landscapes. Equipment problems at the research station, had to get back to town. She nodded as if late-night arrivals from the station were routine rather than extraordinary. I found an empty booth near the window where I could watch the parking lot and see anyone or anything approaching the building. The waitress brought me coffee without being asked, the ceramic mug warming my hands through my gloves. "You'll want to use the phone," she said, pointing toward an old payphone mounted on the wall near the restrooms. "Most folks who come in from that place need to make some calls." The casual way she said it made me look up from my coffee. Most folks who come in from that place. As if researchers fleeing the station in the middle of the night was a regular occurrence rather than an isolated incident. "Does this happen often?" "Every few months someone shows up looking exactly like you do right now. Scared, cold, won't say much about what happened out there." She refilled my coffee cup, even though I'd barely touched it. "Most of them just want to arrange transport out of town as fast as possible." The implications of her words sank in slowly. Other researchers had made the same desperate journey I'd just completed. Other people had discovered that the station's rules weren't paranoid restrictions, but necessary survival protocols. Other rational, scientifically trained individuals had encountered something that shattered their understanding of what was possible in the world. I walked to the payphone and called Dr. Peterson, my department supervisor at the university. The conversation would be tricky. I needed to provide a plausible explanation for abandoning my research assignment without mentioning supernatural encounters that would destroy my academic credibility. The phone rang 4 times before Peterson's groggy voice answered. "Daniel, do you have any idea what time it is?" "I'm sorry to wake you, but I'm having serious equipment failures at the station. The atmospheric monitoring gear is completely malfunctioning, and the heating system is showing signs of breakdown." The lies came easier than I'd expected, probably because they felt less insane than the truth. "I don't think I can complete the research objectives under these conditions." Peterson was quiet for several moments, processing my request to terminate the assignment early. "Are you saying you want to come back?" "I'm saying I need to come back. The equipment problems are too extensive to fix in the field, and staying any longer would compromise data integrity." I kept my voice steady and professional, focusing on concerns that would resonate with academic priorities. "I can arrange alternative atmospheric research locations that won't have these technical limitations." "What about the station supervisor? What does he say about the equipment problems?" The question caught me off guard. How could I explain that David Miller had suggested I find other ways to leave while his eyes went completely blank? How could I describe Thomas Brown's catatonic episodes or Sarah Johnson's careful documentation of impossible supply discrepancies? Miller is dealing with multiple system failures. He agrees that continuing the research under current conditions would be unproductive. Another long pause as Peterson weighed the professional implications of a research assistant abandoning a prestigious assignment. "All right, Daniel. Come back to Anchorage, and we'll discuss alternative arrangements for your research requirements." I hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved and guilty. The lies had protected my academic standing, but they also meant nobody would investigate what was really happening at that station. Future researchers would arrive unprepared, just as I had, expecting normal scientific work instead of a facility governed by rules designed to keep impossible things at bay. I returned to my booth and spent the next several hours watching the parking lot through the diner's windows. Cars passed occasionally on the main street, their headlights sweeping across normal suburban terrain. A police cruiser made 2 routine patrols, the officer waving at the waitress through the glass. A delivery truck stopped at the gas station across the street, and the driver went inside to pay for fuel and buy coffee. Everything was completely, reassuringly ordinary. No massive shapes moved between the streetlights, no unexplained sounds carried across the quiet town. Whatever ruled the darkness around the research station couldn't or wouldn't operate in populated areas. The waitress refreshed my coffee several more times without comment, occasionally glancing out the window as if she understood what I was watching for. Around 4:30, she sat down across from me in the booth. There's a transport service that runs to Anchorage. Owner gets up early and he's used to emergency runs from the station. She slid a business card across the table. Arctic Express Transportation with a phone number and address in town. He'll be awake in about an hour if you want to arrange pickup. I studied the card, noting it was worn smooth from frequent handling. How many other researchers had received this same recommendation? How many people had fled that station and needed immediate transport away from the area? Thank you. This is exactly what I need. She nodded and returned to her work behind the counter, leaving me alone with my coffee and the growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much larger than a single isolated incident. The station's influence had been claiming people for years, and the local community had developed informal support systems for those who managed to escape. Dawn came gradually, gray light replacing the artificial illumination of streetlights. I watched the town wake up around me. People heading to work, children waiting for school buses, dogs being walked on normal suburban streets. The mundane activities felt almost surreal after the supernatural horror I'd experienced just hours earlier. At 6 o'clock, I called Arctic Express Transportation. The owner, a practical-sounding man named Frank, agreed to pick me up at the diner within the hour. No questions about why I needed emergency transport or what had happened to bring me to town in the middle of the night. Apparently, requests like mine were routine enough that explanations weren't necessary. Frank arrived in a heavy-duty pickup truck equipped with tire chains and emergency gear. He looked like someone who'd spent decades dealing with Arctic conditions and probably unusual passengers. While he loaded my minimal belongings into the truck bed, I took one last look at the snowmobile I'd abandoned in the parking lot. "Someone will deal with that," Frank said, following my gaze. "Station equipment always gets returned eventually." The drive to Anchorage took 3 hours across highways that felt impossibly normal after my desperate flight through the wilderness. Frank maintained polite conversation about weather conditions and road maintenance, carefully avoiding any questions about my research work or reasons for leaving. His discretion felt practiced, as if he'd transported many people who needed to get away from the station without discussing what they'd experienced there. At the Anchorage airport, I purchased the first available flight to Seattle, then on to my home university. As the plane taxied down the runway, I pressed my face against the small window and looked down at the vast white expanse of Alaska's interior. Somewhere in that endless landscape, David Miller, Sarah Johnson, and Thomas Brown were still following their nightly routines, still checking window coverings and monitoring supply inventories, still maintaining the rules that kept something unimaginable at bay. The rules I dismissed as paranoid nonsense during my first day at the station. The rules that had seemed like the products of isolation psychology in extreme weather conditions. The rules that were actually a survival manual for coexisting with something that existed outside the boundaries of scientific explanation. As the plane gained altitude and the white landscape disappeared beneath cloud cover, I pulled out my notebook and carefully wrote down each rule exactly as David Miller had presented them to me. Not because I planned to return to that place, but because I finally understood that some knowledge came with a price too dangerous to pay. The rules weren't restrictions. They were the only thing standing between human reason and something that could shatter it completely. I never filed an official report about what really happened at the research station. Nobody would have believed me. And more importantly, Trying to explain it would have meant risking my sanity by dwelling on experiences that had no place in a rational world. Instead, I focused on completing my graduate degree, using data from conventional research locations, where the only variables were atmospheric pressure and wind patterns. But I kept those rules written in my notebook, a reminder that the universe contained mysteries that were better left uninvestigated. Some doors should remain closed, some questions should stay unasked, and some places were dangerous not because of what they lacked, but because of what they contained.